Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our wonderful co-sponsor, the American Book Center, I'm so excited to welcome you to today's event with Ellis Halperin, Iain Boal, and Dick Russell for a panel discussion of Halperin's latest book, an essay in the history of the radical sensibility in America, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman, moderated by LAURA FILLMORE. Today's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we're able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For today's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask the speakers anything, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of today's book. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. And lastly, as you may have experienced during virtual gatherings this last year, as I'm sure you have, technical issues might come up. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Ellis Halperin began sharing his parents' thrilling embrace of America's and Europe's great radical writing in the 1930s. He was educated at Uppsala College, followed by Columbia University, where his interest in the radical sensibility gained further ground. He has previously taught at Harvard University and the New England Conservatory of Music. Iain Boal is a social historian of science, techniques, medicine, and the commons. After teaching in the History of Science department at Harvard, he held teaching posts at Stanford and UC Berkeley. He's a founder of the Mayday Rooms in Fleet Street, London, a social space and safe haven for archives of dissent threatened with loss or erasure. Dick Russell is an activist, environmentalist, and the author of 13 nonfiction books, including The Natural History, Eye of the Whale, named a Best Book of the Year by 3 major newspapers, and The Man Who Knew Too Much. A prolific contributor to some of the biggest publications worldwide, his writing has been featured everywhere from Sports Illustrated, The Village Voice, and the New York Times. They are joined by moderator LAURA FILLMORE, e-publishing pioneer and founder of Open Book Systems, Inc. Since 1982, LAURA and OBS have been revolutionizing the book trade, establishing some of the first online platforms that have benefited authors, publishers, and booksellers everywhere. So thank you for your contributions to the world of books, LAURA. Today, they'll be discussing Halperin's book, An Essay in the History of the Radical Sensibility in America, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman, a patient and learned consideration of the work of some of America's finest minds that Zhu Zhimong calls as thought-provoking as it is heartwarming. The word radical at this challenging point in global history is difficult to singularly define. We are told it can be synonymous with compassion, a drive for community and equality for all, just as often as we are told it is another word for malice, for tendencies that can be destructive or derailing. In Halperin's careful reading of the past and its literatures, he uncovers a radical sensibility rooted in benevolence, in kindness, and in a faith in millennial progress that desperately needs reviving. Rarely do we get to experience a book that is as generous in its politics as it is in the love of literature. We are so thrilled to be hosting this event this afternoon. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our panelists. The digital podium is all yours. Lee, Iain, Dick, and LAURA.
Thank you, Benjamin, and welcome to everybody in the Zoom audience. It looks like we have close to 100 people from around the world to join us in this great celebration of Lee Halperin's brand new book, The Essay in the History of the Radical Sensibility in America. I'd like to thank Harvard Bookstore for hosting the event and for the American Book Center in Amsterdam for co-sponsoring the event. Special thanks to our panelists, Iain Boal and Dick Russell, and especially the author we celebrate today, Lee Halperin. Halperin's book was begun in the 1950s during the McCarthy era, while he was a teaching fellow at Harvard University. Professor Oscar Hanlon, a mainstream liberal historian, strongly supported Halprin's views of equalitarianism and democracy. After first reading this book, then in thesis format, Hanlon said to Halprin, "This will change the way we think about these things." Later on the same day, at a faculty-student gathering, Halprin heard Hanlon defending mainstream liberal politics, just exactly what his book, his thesis, was centrally opposing. Halprin walked out of the room and out of Harvard and didn't return. For some years, Halprin attempted, without Hanlon's help, to get the book published. Editor Angus Cameron, who contracted for J.D. Salinger and Lillian Hellman when he was an editor at Little Brown, contracted for the book and enthusiastically tried to get it published at Knopf in hardcover and by John Simon at Vintage as a paperback. But because of the political turmoil of the McCarthy era, both Halprin's editors left the company and the book wasn't published. So today, some 60 years later, under conditions perhaps even more threatening to democracy than during the McCarthy era, Skyhorse brings Halprin's book out for the first time. This is in the face of authoritarianism through big pharma, censorship through big tech, and the growing unity of government and corporations pointing to the impossibility of democracy and capitalism coexisting. What today's audience faces is not new, but it is serious. Today we join Lee Halprin and his wife Abby Rockefeller and Dick Russell and Iain Boal, Halprin's friends and colleagues, in an informal conversation focusing on two of the chapters of the book. Dick Russell will start off discussing Chapter 9, the exuberant radicalism of the 1960s, and Iain Boal will then discuss Chapter 10, democracy and technology. By way of introduction, both panelists live in intentional communities of more than 10 people, family and friends, carrying forward a communal living tradition with roots in the 19th century utopian communities of Oneida, Fruitlands, and Brook Farm. To frame our conversation, consider how Halprin describes Melville's Billy Budd as, quote, a story of those who perpetuate or endure the world's hereditary wrongs rather than revolt against them. In Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables, Hawthorne wrote, "Is it a fact, or have I dreamt it, that by means of electricity, the world of matter has become a great nerve, vibrating thousands of miles in a breathless point of time? Rather, the round globe is a vast head, a brain, instinct with intelligence, or shall we say, it is itself a thought, nothing but thought, and no longer the substance which we deemed it." During our own breathless point in time, our hour together, the panelists will explore what Melville called the, quote, rectification of the old world's hereditary wrongs, what they might look like today. Their conversation will explore democracy ranging from the global. Dick Russell wrote the bestseller, The Man Who Knew Too Much, about the assassination of JFK, to what is vulnerable, fragile, communal, and powerful about democracy. Iain Boal's forthcoming book, The Green Machine, tells the global history of the bicycle where technology meets democracy. The format, Dick will start off and speak for about 10 minutes, and Iain then will follow with his 10 minutes, and a conversation will ensue for another 10 minutes. Then Abby Rockefeller will read the final two paragraphs of Halprin's afterword to set the stage for the question and answer session that will take up the last 15 minutes of our hour. Please use the Q&A window to ask any questions and make any comments you would like the panel and author to entertain. And so without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to Dick Russell to bring us to the exuberant time of the 1960s.
Thank you so much, Laura, and it's a great privilege to be able to talk to so many of you today about Lee Halprin's remarkable book, which I'm so glad has finally seen publication. You know, it's been almost a century since D.H. Lawrence published his penetrating analysis of the American psyche. It was called Studies in Classic American Literature. And now Ellis Halperin takes up the work of four of the same mid-19th century writers, Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman, in setting forth a unique vision of where we are and where we need to go. Now, Lawrence used these examples of these writers to critique a young nation, wishing to pull the democratic and idealistic clothes off American utterance, as he put it. Halprin embarks on a similar quest, but his interest is in how these writers defined a radical sensibility, one that extols the virtues of kindness and courage while insisting on conditions for the extension of democracy. If not the answers, then the insight to know how necessary they are, Halprin believes can be found in, quote, these writers who gave to the love of benevolence and of knowing a sense of history, of human nature, of society that it had not had before, and that it ignored only to lose a wisdom commensurate with the beauty of its aspirations. Now, his chapter, entitled The Exuberant Radicalism of the 1960s, examines the wrong-headed expectation of the sudden and total beatification of the world. The result of that expectation became a factionalism, leading to laissez-faire acquiescence by the left and to the questions that Lee raised in his poignant afterword. And I'll just read a brief quote from that. How shall we understand the difference between those of us who see the greatest goodness in wealth and market competition to accumulate it, and those of us who see the greatest goodness in liberty, fraternity, and equality? How shall we understand this deep, deep division amongst us, this difference in our motives and our understandings on which our survival itself may well depend? Now, I came of age in the 1960s. I was a Midwestern kid and a sports writer. My whole life was based around sports until one day I woke up and realized that there was a Vietnam War, there was a civil rights struggle, friends who were taking psychedelic drugs and becoming hippies. Now, my parents, who were relatively conservative Republicans, not far right as we have today, but like many others, they've sought security for their children after World War II. And like others in my generation, most of these were children of affluence who did not defend the status quo of privilege. I remember in our home, we had Dr. Spock's book on child rearing, permissive child rearing. And there's a great line in Lee's book where he says, the trouble for the parents comes when it turns out that they will have empowered in their children both a general self-respecting assertiveness and particular desires that the parents themselves do not admire. Lee writes about the unquestionable moral dignity of one's own devotions, a surprise at our own altruism and exhilaration of militancy for its sake. Now, the 60s began for me with understanding about civil rights for Blacks and then students, and particularly of interest, the folk music revival that harkens back to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and Leadbelly and Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. And then in the 60s, along came Bob Dylan and the Newport Folk Festival. It was a hopeful time, unbelievably hopeful time, actually more for some of those who were elder than me than myself. But then with the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, the systematic wiping out of our great leaders began. Interesting to me was what set them apart, their ability, their willingness to change. JFK with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he was sought an accommodation with the Soviets and with Castro. Malcolm X, who went from an extremely militant man to trying to forge an alliance with Martin Luther King. And then in 1968, the deaths of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. They were all cut down, I came to discover years later, by the same forces. And for me, 1968 was the key year. Bobby Kennedy came to KU, where I was going to school in the Midwest, to give his first speech when he announced for president. He was a truly, at that point, compassionate man who'd once been a rather ruthless attorney general. But with his brother's death, he changed deeply and became what would have been a truly benevolent leader, the kind that Lee talks about in his book. But in one event after another happened in those years and ensured that I was never going to be the same. So I got my dream job when I was 20 years old. I went to work for Sports Illustrated magazine in New York, and I quit after 7 full-time months. I took off with a backpack and a portable typewriter and traveled around the world for a year and a half. My parents thought I was crazy. I came back and I became part of an intentional community that emerged out of the folk music world. Now, Lee in his book talks about when the New Left formed in the early 1960s, it was remarkably free of factionalism, that what joins them is much richer than what divides. But not only amity was bred, but also the expectation of imminent revolutionary transformation of all American society. And in the frustration of our expectations and desires, many turned angry energy on each other, what Lee called the capitalism's power to endure and to impose its cruelties on the world surprised the radical sensibility and made it strident or melancholy. And I remember well in 1970 came the invasion of Cambodia and then the deaths of 4 students at Kent State in Ohio. The realization that we might have to make the same ultimate sacrifice if we were going to really change the world. As Lee put it, everybody of every age seemed suddenly to have gotten older. So what happened after that? We got Reagan 10 years later, and then 2 Bushes, and finally Donald Trump, the antithesis of everything we once fought for and believed in. Lee puts it like this: those in power see to it that most of us have quite safe neighborhoods and enough of the necessities and the luxuries to keep things calm enough for preoccupation by the everyday's established balance of those to fight, those to befriend, and those to ignore. No big dangers, no big questions. So we may inch dumbly toward our system's imminent catastrophes. He also says the left's analysis of the majority's self-interest hasn't been as persuasive as capitalism's appeal to the individual's craving for compensatory redemption from the past's humiliations. There's some beautiful lines in the book that go like that. So today we have a world where environmental disasters are looming. And the question Lee raises, how shall we understand those of us who seem to be liking capitalism better than survival? But we do have a new generation out there. We have Greta Thunberg and thousands of young people fighting for a future that's being denied them by the big energy corporations and by our own complacency. They are coming together, forming small communities, coming together to fight what I can only call the creeping decay. And I really hope that they'll read Lee's book, because they need to know that we have wise elders in our society who have something to impart from the past that we can take into a new future. Lee writes in the afterword, it could be that the passion for dominance rises out of ambivalence and gets its awesome and very widely shared energy from the thwarting of a deeper desire. Love, perhaps, and kindness that love loves, and for the beautiful radiance of mutuality's opened hearts. Those words have a lot to tell us in these times. Really tremendously difficult times that we're going through with the pandemic. And what I fear is coming unless we wake up to it, and that's a much more authoritarian world where democracy may no longer even exist. I'll get to some of that later in the question and answer period or when Iain and I are talking, but at this point, I will turn it over to Iain Boal.
Thank you, Dick Russell. Iain, I wonder if you have some comments on the provocative thoughts that Dick Russell just raised in your segue to democracy and technology.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for those words, Dick. It's one of the pleasures of my life to be invited to join in the launching of Lee's book today. What it has to say apparently proved too much for the gatekeepers in the publishing houses of Cold War America, but not so happily for the folks at Skyhorse. Kudos to them. Now, the radical sensibility that Lee proposes is always in a dialectical relation to the prevailing orthodoxies of an epoch. And sensibility is radical insofar as it confronts and exposes the sentimentalisms of traditional systems, moralizing institutions that have rationalized inequality, say feudalism, monarchy, religious hierarchies, private property, tyrannies of various stripes. The appearance of Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman in the mid-19th century and their radical sensibilities needs explaining. And Halprin argues that it's the potent technological innovations of the so-called Industrial Revolution with its powers to manipulate nature unsettled and broke up the moral unity of the earlier American certainties. And it certainly involved a movement from simplicity to complexity, and eventually leading to the works of those masters of suspicion, Freud, Marx, Weber. But all the old ideologies amounted, in Halprin's view, to various forms of betrayal of the common folk. Now, contrary to the Emersonian suspicion of the machine in the garden, Halprin regards industrialism, that's to say the instruments and powers of Homo faber, celebrated and catalogued by Whitman, as the essential condition of possibility of the American Renaissance and of a generalized cooperation, benevolence that would supplant or would be in a tendency away from Darwinian competition. But if you look at the 20th century and its history, the machinery question, as it was called at the turn of the 19th century, the moment of the Luddites and practical criticism of the looms that were throwing a generation of children working at the looms into misery and death. The 20th century the technologies of wealth, to use Lee's phrase, raise profound questions about the techniques, the technologies of wealth, and to what extent they actually provide the possibility of, in another beautiful quote, extending the universe of sympathetic identification. Now, a generation before the counterculturalists that Dick was speaking of the 60s, before they developed the idea of appropriate technology, part of a cohort that turned away from the script written for them in post-war America. A generation before that, Lewis Mumford developed the idea of a contrast between democratic and authoritarian techniques. And in fact, about 50, 100 meters from where I sit in North Berkeley, Mumford was living at the time in Berkeley and wrote a very famous essay, and he was in the house of Carl Sauer, the patriarch of historical geography. And he wrote a famous essay against nuclearism. And certainly the book, Lee's essay, is haunted by the technologies of Armageddon, of exterminism and extinction, which trips easily off the tongue now, as he says. Again, I quote here, we do not need, he says, something special to keep, we do need something special to keep vital the assertion that extinction is not okay. So this is a world of, as Poe put it, a world of sweets and sours. The word sweet was used by Robert Oppenheimer, who lived in a house just up to my left on Hawthorne Terrace when he was designing the atomic bomb with others in the 1940s. He used the word sweet to describe the bomb when asked why he didn't stop when it was known that Heisenberg was not going to be able to lead the Third Reich to this weapon of omnicide. That bears thinking about. It's reached the point where we require a philosophy of technology, a serious discussion far beyond the sound bites that we can manage today, but one that I hope this book will help trigger, a serious discussion about the philosophy of technology. It's not good enough to say that technology is neutral, which many Marxists and liberals have claimed, that it's somehow, there's good uses and bad uses. The question arises in terms of the extension of the universe of sympathetic identification. What forms of prostheses, what forms of the technosphere and modes conduce towards what kinds of tools make loving more likely? It seems to me a very interesting question. And we would do, I think, to look to the example of the Amish, not to defend a gerontocracy, shall we say, but to ask the question, should we not have a discussion in advance of these new, of any suite of innovative technologies? So, for example, it's interesting to me that there was very, very little understanding of the consequences of automobilism and the paving of large parts of the United States for the tarmac superhighway in the 1950s. Cyclists can get quite smug about this beautiful mode of automobility. There's a bicycle behind me, and I'm a partisan of bicycles. But the fact is that it was the cyclists who demanded the paving of the planet, and whose final build out in Western China and the Tibetan highlands is ongoing now. Automobility is a very interesting example that we need to examine. What forms of sociability, what forms of life and conviviality are conduced by, shall we say, the bicycle compared to the automobile? Illich, who's one of the advocates of, I think, of a very, appropriate technological questions, regarded, speed as absolutely a sine qua non of convivial and benevolent community. That once you get beyond about 12 miles an hour, plus or minus, there is bound to be a dearth of equity, not just because automobiles are examples of capitalist private techniques moving through public space, but because there's no way around that. There's no way to make that equalitarian impulse real. And we could ask the same things about biotechnology, about dams. Mumford's railing against megatechnics is interesting. There are those in the West here who, when they saw a small dam, disliked it intensely because what it spoke to was the privatism of American capital, whereas big dams were exactly one of those technologies that extended the universe of sympathetic identification and a life of ease and invention. That goes against, of course, what we now think of as the proper attitude to big dams. And we could go through a whole suites of technologies. Maybe I'll just finish because I've only got a couple of minutes here to say that we might want to put McLuhan in conversation with Zuckerberg and ask the question about the new techniques of information, which seem to have resulted in the colonization of everyday life, which is certainly not congenial to the flourishing of sympathy, it seems. Whatever the case, whatever we feel about the relation between technics and democracy and the extension of benevolence, there are no guarantees. I find hope in what I think might be a very fruitful engagement between the newly emerging indigenous movements, the decolonial movements, and what one might call the history of the Euro-American left and its attitude to industrial socialist technologies and otherwise. I think all of us, who does not smell the carrion breath of the greed monster breathing down on us? But our dignity resides not in our victories, but in our cause. I'll stop there and maybe pick up some of these issues in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Iain Boal. And Dick, I wonder if you'd like to join in with Iain and maybe focus on the benevolent track that Halprin so wisely introduced, so we can have something to hold up against that carrion breath of greed that Iain raised, and look forward to the two of you commenting on each other's good points.
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing today is truly an entry into a new age or a new era. And the question is, which way are we as a society going to go? And I feel like the interest, especially in a number of young people and some who are not so young, in the indigenous traditions, everything from which I'm very interested in shamanism and psychedelics. You know, the rise of interest in ayahuasca and substances that can open the mind that the indigenous peoples have known about for centuries, and also the new agriculture. You know, going back to carbon farming, to putting carbon back in the ground instead of extracting it everywhere. I think there is a real opportunity for a whole new way of doing things that harkens back many centuries and gets us away from what terrifies me about today's world and the trend toward what's called transhumanism, where through artificial intelligence, through genetic engineering, we're looking at a world that will be unfamiliar to certainly many of us who are elders in this society, and frightening in its way. So there's just so much that the new generation has to be aware of and to fight. And I would say that initially about the technology that we're looking at, and the indigenous ways of approaching things that could take us in a different direction.
How about you, Iain?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not proposing a return to some romancing, say, of the Red Man. And I think one of the beautiful things about this book is that it continually reminds us that we have to avoid the sentimentalisms of what might at a certain point be a radical critique of the existing order. I think it's clear now that we simply don't know. It's impossible to say what the consequences of any particular technical arrangements will be. You might say in shorthand that every technology is a congealed ideology. The internal combustion engine was which produced the motor car, produces a certain kind of sensibility, a certain kind of characterology is produced by these machines. It doesn't mean that it's impossible to work against it, but there's a value slope and it makes it much harder. So I guess I'm asking for a kind of a provisionality. It was very encouraging for the first time in human history, thanks to the resistance in the fields about the privatization of the world's germplasm and the seeds, was resisted by people who refused to concede that the seeds, which are, after all, the gift to the farmer, nature's gift to the farmer, that they should be privatized. So I guess, again, this would be another reason to look to the commoning cultures of the indigenous world. The anti-commodity is the common. You could say that the common is the is the inverse of the commodity. And so we have to go recommoning. And I don't think there's any other way than having long indabas, long discussions about, particular technical innovations. I don't see any way around it.
I wonder if you both could comment on what Lee Halprin brings up as the impossibility of the coexistence of capitalism and democracy, before we turn the microphone over to Abby Rockefeller to read those last two paragraphs and Lee to say hello to his audience. Do you want to start, Dick, on the capitalism and democracy? Can we have both indeed? Is there hope?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly I'm not opposed to true free market capitalism, but I don't think that's what we have today. And when you see the fortunes of the figure, I think 9 of America's tech barons increased their wealth by $360 billion over the past year during the pandemic, while millions around the world were suffering in ways that have not occurred in many, many years, if ever. And so there's a terrible inequity in the society. And so unfettered capitalism, I am not in favor of. And I feel like maybe we're getting to a point now where things are so split that, I mean, you've seen it in some of what President Biden's trying to do, rectify some of this. I'm certainly not in favor of returning to a romantic past where the indigenous societies had all the answers. That's not going to get us where we need to go. But I'm encouraged by the fact that young people are starting to to rise up against injustice, like we saw in the protests last summer. Not just young people, but joining together with their elders, and there are some very encouraging signs that the country is capable of having democracy. But when I see that they're talking in the future about chipping us, having us have vaccine passports in order to travel, using artificial intelligence to basically take over our jobs and our world, that scares the hell out of me. And I think there's a lot that people are not aware of that's going on underneath the surface of this pandemic that we've got to wake up to and come together to fight.
Thank you, Dick. Ian,
yes, can I say something to that?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm with Lee. I'm with Halprin on this one. The time for continued trust in private powers is past. It's surely clear. On the other hand, I don't believe that democracy is incompatible with capitalism. You might say that in a way, democracy is one of the forms that the capitalist order takes. So to that extent, so much in a way, the worse for democracy. But I'm not sure that it's democracy that is the deepest impulse in Lee's text. Democracy is, on its own account anyway, consistent with slavery, with monarchy. I mean, take the UK. So I think we have to say that we can't turn this ship around under capitalism. But then the question arises, and of course it was a question that exercised Chuck Marx and his generation. Who will be the gravedigger? I'm hoping that there might be a powerful planet-wide movement of what one might call the injuriat. That's to say, the class of those injured by the technologies that we've been discussing. Not just the downwinders and those maimed in the slaughter on the roads and many other horrors coming out of the dusty trades, for example. But but a class of humans, which includes almost all of us, as I say, which will transcend borders and boundaries, and will come to see that we have no option as we move into the Anthropocene, which is, after all, just the name we've given to the place that industrialism has, and the carrion breath of profit has brought us. That would be my position.
Well, thank you, Iain. We're being asked, Lee Halperin, for you to say hi to your audience. And Abby, perhaps you want to read those two paragraphs after Lee greets his troops. Thank you, Lee.
Hello.
Hi, Lee.
Hi, Lee. So Abby, you want to read the last two paragraphs of the afterword?
Yeah. Yes, I do. So there are people who test one's hopeful faith that their cruelties and indifferences are not simple expressions of their natures, but contortions wrought by their own sufferings. That is why I make so much of the logic that calls them sadomasochists. Sadomasochists could have been lovers, I say, but didn't get the chance and hope only for the intimacies of revenge. Where's the consolation in that? Well, if it's true that safety makes loving more likely, and we can nourish our talents for extending and deepening safety, and with each extension and each deepening tilt our ambivalence toward trusting, hence toward affection and respect and kindness, hence toward love, even of life itself, even. Well, that ought to be somewhat more inspiriting of us leftists than seeing the looming doom as nothing but the fulfillment of our basic competitivist destructiveness, bringing extinction in the way that getting very big and strong has been thought to have done it for dinosaurs, for example. I want to put in a little extension of the word leftists here and say, put in place of that, lovers of life, all, be they what they may, allies of life, all. Thank you.
Thank you.
That. You all.
Thank you, Abby.
Beautiful.
I'd like to turn it over to the folks who are with us today. We have a number of questions up there. And we'll start with Madhava Sethi, who says she would love it if Dick, Iain, or Mr. Halprin could comment on the existence of a hidden hand or hidden hands guiding the trajectory of our species. Are they suspicious of such a thing? I would imagine Mr. Russell is. You want to start, Dick? On the hidden hand or hidden hands guiding the trajectory of our species. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I do. I think there is a hidden hand in the sense that there's I'm not saying there's a quote secret society or something out there, trying to bend everybody to its will. But there definitely are people out there who are quite wealthy and have sort of, well, I'm going to just say Bill Gates has pulled the wool over a lot of people's eyes. And I am very alarmed at the fact of that what he's been trying to do in the course of this pandemic. And he's looked at as trying to save humanity. And I just think it's that's part of this hidden hand. And it's very concerning to me. And I think people need to know a lot more about it.
Iain, did you have a comment on that?
just to say that Hidden Hand, of course, conjures up the Scottish Enlightenment and the notion that that private power will work towards the common good. And it seems to me that this book is profoundly challenging that, at least arguing that it's very ambiguous in its legacy. Although Lee, begins with the proposition that private industry produced this remarkable renaissance of the authors that he so powerfully explicates. No, there's no hidden hand. There are no guarantees. We're on our own as a species, although we do have allies in the more than human world around us. And that's one of the things I think that the so-called left, and I take Abby's addendum, I think, to heart. That would be one of the ways in which we get past the Newtonian mechanical universe, not to some metaphysical vitalism, but to insist that on the sacredness of life. I guess I'm returning to some kind of animism in my seniority. How else are the waters and the airs going to be made safe from the depredations of Mandingo?
That's good.
And that's by the kind and benevolent actions of each individual as individuals, as opposed to corporations. Am I hearing that right, Iain? No, Abby, right?
I don't think
Communities.
so. Abby, yeah, jump in, Abby.
I just said, not either one of them. Communities, wholesome communities is what we have lost and could get.
Yes, I go with that.
So would I. Yeah.
Madhava would too.
In an Neva Goodwin asks, in an ideal world, how would technology support equality instead of inequality? Do you want to take that first, Dick, and then Iain?
Let me think about that for a minute. Well, I mean, technology is with us to stay, and I think in an ideal world, we would be able to move more quickly into what's got to happen, which is we've got to get away from fossil fuels. We need to put electric cars and charging stations on the road. We've got to have a technological revolution, in a sense, that gets us away from the paradigm we've been living in since the automobile came along. And how are we going to do that? How do we get away from coal everywhere, all over the world? I mean, these are absolute necessities if we're going to survive. I mean, as a civilization, I don't think that we're going to be totally wiped out. But civilization is going to fall victim to sea level rise and so the changing planet. If we go to 1.5 C or higher, what we're going to see is, or what our children are going to see, especially, is really pretty terrible to conjure. So that's how technology can help us, I think, in a benevolent and vital way.
Did you have an opinion about that, Iain?
Oh, it's a huge question.
It's a big question.
I guess we've been going at little bits of it. I just say from my own research, if you look at the introduction of particular forms of technology that have shattered communities, it's a very complicated story. The introduction of the snowmobile among the Sami in the Arctic had very inequalitarian consequences, and they weren't exactly predictable. The same, I would say, with big tractors. Lenin loved electricity and big tractors. because it seemed to usher in the kind of world of plenty that Lee speaks about as a necessary condition for the flourishing of all. But it, in many ways, it's turned out badly. It's been disappointing. Again, I'm not arguing necessarily for the countercultural move, which says, you know, we want a world in which the largest piece of apparatus is a Black & Decker power drill. It's just very, very complicated. It's not a satisfactory thing to be hearing from me here. There's no particular size or scale, I think. As I say, it's a kind of value slope. It's tendential. The Industrial Revolution, of course, was the world of the factory and the grisly history of, you know, the river of iron that's coming out of the armaments factories, or the deadly machinery of the Bonsack apparatus, which has produced the largest public health catastrophe in human history, the flu-cured cigarette. All these things have become naturalized in the modern world. But I don't think we can say that it's a particular scale that matters. So I think the Amish question is a good one, when they debated the telephone, whether to allow the telephone in the house or not. You know, it seems a minor episode, but it's a very interesting question, and not one that you can easily predict. And there's no guarantee. There's no such thing as a democratic technology in that sense. As I say, the Industrial Revolution, the huge productivity of the 19th century, in the period
We're having some
set. Sorry, just to finish the thought. The huge increase in productivity owed as much to the cat o' nine tails as it did to the cotton gin. It's not to do with the sophistication necessarily of the machinery.
Thank you, Iain. We have an interesting question from Laurie Kirschman. What are your thoughts about how we might bring radical sensibility into the minds and hearts of those resistant to equanimity? Dick, you want to take this one?
Yeah, how do we do that?
Yeah.
Well, it's a huge question. And I mean, I think that education is absolutely critical. That a lot of people, you know, just don't know what's really going on in our society, and you know, education has been privatized also, to the point where certain people want to tell us, you know, what we should learn about. And you know, I think people, but I think even people on the right, so-called, are concerned about censorship and the fact that, you know, so much of, if you disagree with the status quo, which we've certainly seen in the whole situation with the pandemic and vaccines, if you don't agree with what's going on, or try to point out the fallacies in some of it, then you're often taken off social media and blackballed from the bigger media. And that is, democracy cannot survive with censorship thriving. And it's more of a world that Orwell foresaw in 1984, or Huxley in Brave New World, that we've got to realize that they were very prescient people. And that's all I can say about it, is that people who have got to start waking up to what's going on.
Thank you. And that ties in with a question from Madhava Sethi. What do these erudite gentlemen have to say about the rising complacency we seem to have around censorship? How can we combat it without being censored ourselves? Iain, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah.
Difficult question.
Yeah, well, but it's a very interesting question. what I'll just point to is an experiment in democratic techniques, and it might also speak to the question about bringing radical sensibility into the minds and hearts. There was an interesting experiment started by conscientious objectors in the Second World War who decided that the world of small radical pamphlets was not enough. And they decided to start a radio station that was required a license from the state. So that's true. Here, actually, in Berkeley, it was the renegade child of the Phillips oil empire that became a kind of young existentialist philosopher, and they began Pacifica Radio precisely as a move against censorship. And the idea was to start to introduce a more peaceable world through radical dialogics. Not that there was just one position, but many positions. And it was to that they dedicated their work at KPFA. Again, they came up against the state censors, and no doubt, radio is the reason that there's a good reason why the German Third Reich liked radio for propagandistic purposes, because it's easy to turn it to the discourse of domination. But there's always, I think, hope in pushing back against censorship through alternative networks. But it does require us to rethink, again, turning over the common airwaves into private hands.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we come near the end of our hour, I'd like to put a question out from Lynn in Amsterdam to everybody on the panel. And it is, does anyone have examples of daily acts of radical kindness which might spread like perfume through our spaces? So looking for guidance on applying Lee's book. Any volunteers to take this, Abby or Dick or Ian? Acts of radical kindness we can take?
Yeah, I'll jump in before you, Dick, if that's all right.
Yes, please. I'm thinking.
What the techniques we've been talking about mostly are, shall we say, masculinist. I would just say that from the work of Silvia Federici and any number of women and female scholars, it's clear that that the world is full of acts of radical kindness at every moment. Capitalism would not last a day without the formerly hidden work of mostly women. The national system of accounts essentially has historically overlooked, and for actuarial purposes, completely overlooked all unpaid labor. And the work of social reproduction goes on under the radar. I don't think we should be pointing with surprise at acts of kindness. The question is how it enters politics. And that's why I think this book is such a profound meditation on that question. It needs to be put in the hands of the generation who are going to inherit our world now.
And you were just addressing that generation, Dick, when you were speaking of the Greta Thunbergs of the world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the movement that she has inspired, just because she got out there one day and started a sit-in in Sweden, not going to class because of what was happening to her planet, has moved probably millions of people. And there was a documentary recently about her on PBS that I really recommend to others because she's someone who has a disability herself, and yet has gone out there and truly that's an act of kindness to a generation. I find myself very inspired by her and people like her.
Thank you. Abby, Lee, did you have anything you wanted to add, or should I go to the next question? Radical acts of
Thank you.
kindness.
It's good to hear. It's so good to hear you all and to hear the kindness, the community in what you say. Hello.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, thank you. And I wish we could answer all the questions. I think we could go on for much longer. We've got many, many yet unanswered questions, but I'm afraid that our time is up and we're going to have to say goodbye to everybody. I think we might end on one last question, if we might, Benjamin, if that's okay, from Dee Dee. Is it possible to have a democratic media? She goes on to say the Pacifica network Iain is speaking about is just as I wrote this, but is it possible? And I'd like Dick and Iain to talk about that again in the context of benevolent acts of kindness before we wrap up our time together.
Well, I think it's certainly possible because we have examples like Iain cited of how that can be. It's increasingly difficult because of the concentration of media power in a very few hands, when you have huge corporations snapping up media in cities and states all over the country, and even places consolidating with big networks where you have not technocrats but corporations basically dictating or able to dictate what we see. It was a much simpler world when we just had CBS, ABC, and NBC and Walter Cronkite telling us
once a day.
once a day what there was. So, but I'm hopeful that perhaps with the rise of the internet and the globally connected world that we have, that if we can see through the chaff, we can still have that kind of democratic media in the future.
Yes, can I
Please.
Can I just say a shout out to Dee Dee? Perhaps a number of people watching, listening, won't know the extraordinary work over the many years that Dee Dee has done in alternative, so-called democratic media, deep dish television and others, the refunctioning of the existing infrastructure for the purposes of emancipatory and benevolent conversation, and the unmasking of power as well, tremendously important. And good luck to her in the struggle for the Pacifica network. One of its stations, WBAI, she mentions in the Q&A box, is in very serious straits, and we desperately need to try to rescue Pacifica. The founders were under no illusion that that the liberals might take over, and that's one of the problems, is that we have the problem of organizational form, and behind everything that Lee writes in the book is the question of the forms of community, of which the technical mediations are just one example. Perhaps I'll just finish by saying that it's not clear that we need to feed the world. We can only feed the world through a kind of Gates-style green revolution with enormous amounts of petrochemistry applied to the fields. Again, this is one of the ways in which we have to. All the work is almost still to be done with respect to agriculture and the democratic media, which is, you could say, the condition of possibility for getting out of this mess. I'm glad we finished on that spot, because of course it's what we're using right now in all its kind of half-baked, awkwardness and what have you. But I must say I've found this a very inspiring, and I'm so sorry that all these other questions in the Q&A won't be getting addressed, but I, for one, would like to pick up on a few of them on the back channel afterwards, if Benjamin can make that happen. I don't know.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody, and especially Lee Halperin for writing such an inspirational book and giving us the opportunity to have such a stimulating conversation with Dick Russell and Iain Boal and our audience, with engaging us with these questions that really beg to be answered and have great immediacy. And we'd like to thank Harvard for sponsoring us and American Book Center for co-sponsoring the event. And once again, I hope everybody can buy a copy of Lee's book, electronic or print, and be inspired for those radical acts of kindness that will define the communities of our future. Thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, all of you, for spending for this fantastic and timely conversation. And thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your afternoon with us. And thank you, as always, to our wonderful co-sponsor, the American Book Center, for helping make this event happen. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase your copy at harvard.com. I've put the link in the chat a couple times. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.